6 years ago, my friend Tom and I decided to spend a summer evening at a casino on an Ojibwe reserve. It was a quick, spontaneous decision, an easy 40-minute drive from my parents' cabin. The night promised a bit of fun, a few games of poker, and a break from the quiet cabin life. The casino didn't disappoint. We indulged in table games, enjoyed a decent dinner, and spent hours soaking in the lively atmosphere. By the time we cashed out and stepped into the cool night air, it was nearly 1 a.m. The drive back seemed simple enough, a straight shot down a lonely highway surrounded by dense forest. The first stretch of the drive was uneventful. Highway 17 stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed by darkness, with no streetlights to illuminate the way. Our headlights carved narrow beams through the night, but otherwise the road was silent and deserted. The quiet was comforting at first, a stark contrast to the noise of the casino. Little did we know how quickly that stillness would turn sinister. About 20 minutes into the drive, the silence of the highway was broken by something unexpected. Just ahead, two green orbs reflected off the road, catching my attention. Deer. I slowed the car and braked cautiously, watching as several deer emerged from the trees and crossed the road in front of us. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their presence eerily quiet. Tom chuckled nervously. "Well, that's what you get for driving through the middle of nowhere," he said. I nodded, my focus still on the deer. It was a reminder of how isolated we were. No cars, no streetlights, just the forest pressing in on either side of the highway. Once the deer disappeared into the trees, I eased back onto the gas. We started up a hill, moving cautiously in case more wildlife decided to dart across. The road was so dark that it felt like driving into a void, our headlights the only beacon of safety. That's when we saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure appeared directly in the middle of the lane, walking toward us. I hit the brakes hard, my heart leaping into my throat. The car skidded to a halt just 10 feet short of her. She was young, maybe in her 20s. She wore a white nightgown that seemed to glow faintly in the car's headlights. She was barefoot, her steps slow and deliberate, but it was her face that sent a chill through me. It was completely blank, void of emotion, her eyes staring past us as if we weren't even there. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, unsure of what to do. Tom muttered a curse under his breath, his voice tinged with unease. The woman didn't react to the car or the headlights. Instead, she walked past us, dragging her hand along the side of the car, her fingers trailing eerily across the metal. Neither of us spoke as she disappeared into the darkness behind us. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating. "What the hell was that?" Tom finally whispered. I had no answer. My instincts screamed at me to drive away, but something about her appearance, her strange, silent presence, held me back. The car remained still in the middle of the dark highway, its headlights cutting a sharp beam into the night. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as my heart raced, the surreal image of the woman replaying in my mind. She had looked so out of place, barefoot, dressed in a flowing white nightgown, walking aimlessly in the middle of a desolate road. It felt like a scene ripped from a horror movie. Tom broke the silence, his voice urgent and laced with fear. "Drive, man. Just drive. Whatever that was, we don't want any part of it." I hesitated. A part of me agreed with him, but another part couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. What if she was in trouble? What if she needed help? Tom was adamant, though. "I'm serious," he pressed. "Let's just go. This is how people end up on the news." Against his protests, I put the car in park and opened the door, the cold night air rushing in. I could see her figure ahead, faintly illuminated by the blinking hazard lights I'd switched on for visibility. She was walking slowly up the hill, her back to us, her steps steady but oddly mechanical. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She didn't even pause. Tom groaned loudly from inside the car, the frustration in his voice clear. "What the hell are you doing? Get back in the car." Ignoring him, I stepped further out, my shoes crunching against the gravel shoulder. The woman stopped abruptly, but didn't turn around. She just stood there, her back still facing me, her head slightly tilted as if she were listening. Tom's fear was contagious, and for a moment I considered retreating. Before I could decide, the silence shattered. The woman let out a piercing scream, raw and unearthly, cutting through the still night like a blade. It wasn't a cry for help. It was something primal, something that sent every hair on my body standing on end. The sound seemed to echo, bouncing off the trees and filling the empty expanse of the highway. I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. Tom flung the car door open and stepped out, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Get in the car," he yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. The woman hadn't moved. She just stood there, still facing away, her scream fading into an eerie silence. That was enough for both of us. I turned and bolted back to the car, slamming the door behind me as Tom scrambled into the passenger seat. My hands fumbled with the keys before I managed to start the engine. Without looking back, I hit the gas, speeding down the highway as fast as I could safely go. Neither of us spoke for a while. The sound of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the road were the only noises, but the tension in the car was palpable. My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. As we approached the cabin, Tom finally broke the silence. "You never should have stopped," he muttered, his voice low but firm. "You don't mess with stuff like that. Not out here." He wasn't wrong. The more I replayed the encounter in my head, the more questions swirled. Who was she? Why was she walking alone on such a remote highway in the middle of the night? And that scream, it wasn't just fear or anger. It was something otherworldly, something that didn't belong. When we reached the cabin, we sat in the driveway for a few minutes, neither of us wanting to step into the silence of the woods. Eventually, we went inside, locking every door and window behind us. Neither of us slept well that night, the memory of her figure and that blood-curdling scream haunting our thoughts throughout the night. The summer of 2006 was a time for spontaneity, and a solo road trip seemed like the perfect way to embrace that spirit. I was 22, full of excitement for a weekend visit with a close friend in Pennsylvania. The drive promised a few hours of freedom, just me and the open road. The weather was warm, and my playlist was on point. Everything about the trip felt lighthearted and carefree. After crossing the border from New Jersey into Pennsylvania, I decided to stop at a rest area along I-78. It was a typical highway stop, a mix of gas pumps, vending machines, and a mini-mart. The parking lot was busy with travelers stretching their legs and grabbing snacks. I parked my car and headed toward the store, thinking about what I'd grab to tide me over for the rest of the drive. As I walked, nothing about the scene felt out of the ordinary, until I noticed him. A man in his late 30s or early 40s was walking directly toward me. He was stocky, with dark brown hair and a mustache-goatee combo, dressed casually, but somehow giving off an air of intensity that immediately put me on edge. His eyes locked on me, and he moved closer with a purpose that made my stomach tighten. "Hey," he said, stepping uncomfortably close. His voice was casual but carried an undercurrent of something that felt wrong. "Do you know this area well?" I shook my head quickly, keeping my answers short. "No, just passing through." He didn't seem deterred by my disinterest. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his presence suffocating. "You're not from around here, huh? Where are you headed?" he pressed, his tone friendly but probing. I forced a polite smile, trying to sidestep him. "Just visiting a friend." As I moved to walk away, he shifted to block me, flashing a smile that felt more predatory than warm. "You know, there's a great mini-golf place nearby. We could go play around," he offered. Then, as if he hadn't just made a bizarre suggestion to a complete stranger, he added, "Or we could see a movie. I know a couple of good theaters." I froze, unsure of how to respond. His demeanor was too strange to ignore, too intense, too familiar for someone I'd never met. "No thanks," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. I took a step back, hoping he'd get the hint. He didn't. Instead, his tone turned sharper, almost accusing. "Come on, it'll be fun," he said, as though I was the one being unreasonable. I shook my head again, muttering another quick refusal before brushing past him. As I walked away, his parting words made my skin crawl. "You're gorgeous," he shouted, loud enough to turn heads in the parking lot. The aggression in his voice sent a jolt of fear through me, and I hurried into the store, trying to shake off the encounter. Inside, I lingered longer than necessary, hoping he'd leave. When I finally stepped outside, his truck was gone, and I felt a wave of relief. I chalked it up to a strange but harmless encounter, climbed into my car, and pulled out onto the highway. Little did I know, it wasn't over. Pulling back onto the highway, I felt relieved to be leaving the rest area behind. The man and his unnerving intensity were already fading into memory as I focused on the road ahead. I had a couple of hours left to drive, and my excitement about seeing my friend was beginning to resurface. But as I approached the on-ramp, a honking sound made my heart drop. There he was, parked on a dirt road just off the ramp, his truck partially hidden by trees. He leaned out of the driver's side window, waving his arms and shouting something I couldn't make out. His truck horn blared again, louder and more insistent. Fear gripped me as I realized this wasn't a coincidence. He had been waiting for me. Panic surged through me, and I pressed harder on the gas, merging onto the highway as quickly as I could. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, hoping he wouldn't follow. But within moments, his truck pulled out behind me, accelerating to close the distance. My chest tightened as I realized I was being pursued. I grabbed my phone and called my friend, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. "This guy, I don't know him. He's following me," I said, my words tumbling over each other in a rush. My friend's voice was calm but firm, telling me to keep driving and suggesting we meet at a police station if he didn't stop. I weaved in and out of traffic, trying to lose him. My heart raced as I checked my mirrors constantly, hoping to see his truck fall back. But he stayed with me for miles, his headlights glaring in my rearview mirror like a predator closing in on its prey. My fear grew with every passing second. I knew I had to lose him, but the highway felt endless, the exits too few and far between. My friend stayed on the phone with me, her voice a lifeline as she helped me think through my next moves. "Take the next exit," she said, "but don't stop. Just circle back onto the highway if you need to." I spotted an exit ahead and made a sudden sharp turn, hoping to throw him off. My tires screeched against the asphalt, and I glanced back in time to see his truck struggle to make the same turn. The maneuver bought me a little distance, but it wasn't enough. He adjusted quickly, his truck reappearing in my rearview mirror just seconds later. I drove recklessly, weaving through back roads before merging back onto the highway. Finally, after several miles, his truck began to fall behind. I watched anxiously as the headlights grew smaller and eventually disappeared entirely. Relief washed over me, but it was fragile. I knew he could return at any moment. I stayed on the phone with my friend until I reached her house, where she was waiting anxiously on the front steps. My hands shook as I parked the car and rushed inside. Together, we reviewed what had happened, agreeing to call the police if he showed up again. We even planned a route to the nearest station, just in case. But thankfully, he didn't reappear. Years passed before I thought about that night in detail again. The memory stayed with me, but I chalked it up to a random creep, a bizarre and terrifying incident, but ultimately one without a resolution. Then, during a conversation with a friend who was deeply into true crime, I found myself recounting the story. When I described the man, stocky, dark brown hair, mustache goatee combo, her expression changed. "That sounds a lot like Adam Leroy Lane," she said. I frowned, unfamiliar with the name. She pulled up a picture on her phone, and my stomach turned. The resemblance was striking. Lane was a known serial killer active in the mid-2000s, often targeting women traveling alone. Worse, he was known to operate in Pennsylvania during that time. The possibility that I had crossed paths with someone so dangerous left me shaken all over again. The aggressive way he had pursued me, the strange intensity of our encounter, it all took on a darker meaning. Though I'll never know for sure if it was him, the thought lingers like a shadow, a reminder of how close I may have come to a far worse fate. In 2009, I was 22 years old and driving through the desolate stretches of the loneliest highway. It was 3 a.m., and the darkness around me felt endless. The road stretched on for miles, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through an empty landscape under a sky littered with stars. My car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, casting long, shifting shadows that made the emptiness feel even more oppressive. I was alone except for the occasional hum of my engine, and while the quiet was soothing at first, it soon gave way to unease. As I rounded a curve, my headlights swept across a figure on the side of the road. A woman, waving her arms beside a car with its hood popped open. Her posture was frantic, desperate, and for a moment I hesitated. Stopping for strangers wasn't something I made a habit of, especially not at this hour on an isolated road. But she was petite, seemingly harmless, and looked genuinely in need of help. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over, keeping my engine running as I rolled my window down just enough to speak. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm despite the unease prickling at the back of my neck. She stepped closer, her face barely visible in the dim light, but her body language was odd, tense, almost jittery. "I need to get to town," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "Let me in." Something about the way she demanded it put me on edge. "Do you need me to call someone for you?" I offered instead, but her reaction was immediate and aggressive. "Just let me in," she snapped, her tone accusatory, as though my hesitation was a personal affront. Her insistence made my gut tighten, but I told myself I was being paranoid. She was small. I could handle her if things went sideways. Reluctantly, I unlocked the door and let her in. The moment she got into the car, I regretted it. Her energy was erratic, her movements quick and unpredictable. She sat stiffly, clutching a large purse, and ignored my repeated offers to call for help. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation calm and neutral. She didn't answer right away, her eyes darting to the side mirror as though expecting someone to approach. "Just drive," she finally said, her tone clipped and impatient. I pressed her for more details, but she grew irritated, snapping, "I don't need your questions, just get me out of here." When I was about to start driving, her compartment became more unsettling. She fumbled nervously in her purse, muttering under her breath. I couldn't see what she was searching for, but her erratic movements made my heart race. Something felt very wrong, and I started planning how I'd respond if she tried to do something. My thoughts were interrupted when movement outside caught my eye. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A man was emerging from the shadows near her car, moving toward mine. My blood ran cold as I realized he was heading straight for my driver's side door. Adrenaline surged through me. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring as the car lurched forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man reach for the door handle, but he missed by inches. A loud crack echoed behind me, and my rearview mirror shattered, sending shards of glass into the car. Someone had fired a shot. The woman screamed, her tone shifting from aggression to panic. Realizing their plan had failed, she turned her anger on me, hitting my arm and shouting to be let out. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I sped down the highway, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The shattered rearview mirror swung limply from its housing, the glass fragments glinting in the dim light as I sped down the highway. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, my knuckles white with tension. The woman beside me, her initial panic morphing back into anger, started hitting my arm. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice shrill and unrelenting. "Stop the car!" Her erratic behavior was only fueling my terror. I couldn't process what had just happened, the man reaching for the door, the shot that shattered my mirror, and now I had a passenger who was rapidly losing control. My instincts screamed at me to get rid of her, but stopping in the middle of the desolate road felt like inviting danger. "Calm down!" I barked, my voice breaking under the weight of adrenaline and fear. She didn't listen, clawing at the door handle and continuing to hit me. I scanned the road ahead, my mind racing. Finally, I saw a long stretch of shoulder where I could safely stop. I pulled over, still shaking, and threw the car into park. Before she could make another move, I shoved the door open, stepped out, and rounded the car to her side. "Get away from my car now," I demanded, my voice trembling but firm. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes narrowing as though she were considering her options. Then, without another word, she grabbed her purse, stumbled out of the car, and started walking back the way we'd come. I didn't wait to see where she was going or if the man would reappear. I jumped back into the car and sped off, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The empty highway stretched out before me, but the weight of the encounter lingered, suffocating and oppressive. It wasn't until I'd driven several miles that I noticed the faint chemical smell wafting through the car. Glancing into the back seat, I saw a few items scattered there, things the woman must have left behind in her haste. A small plastic bag with a residue that looked unmistakably like drugs, a lighter, and what appeared to be a wallet with several IDs inside. My stomach sank. The implications were immediate and terrifying. If I kept these items and was pulled over, it wouldn't matter that they weren't mine. The situation would be impossible to explain, and it could derail everything I'd worked toward for my career. I couldn't afford that risk. I pulled over once more, this time in a remote rest area, and gathered everything she'd left behind. Wrapping it all in an old rag, I stuffed it into a trash bin far from the parking lot. With the evidence gone, I felt a fleeting sense of relief, though the fear still clung to me like a shadow. I stopped at a gas station a few towns over, where I found a lone police officer parked in the lot. Approaching his cruiser, I recounted the night's events as calmly as I could, leaving out the part about the discarded items. His expression hardened as I described the man, the shot, and the woman's behavior. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, his tone stern. "But stopping for anyone on a road like that is the dumbest thing you could have done." The words stung, but I couldn't argue. I'd let my good intentions override my instincts, and it had almost cost me everything. It was a warm summer evening, one of those tranquil drives that make you appreciate the stillness of the open road. I was on my way back to Athens, Georgia, after a weekend in Atlanta with my girlfriend. Highway 316 stretched ahead of me, quiet and empty, the setting sun painting the horizon in soft hues of orange and pink. My car hummed along smoothly, and I let my mind wander as the miles rolled by. As I approached a red light at a crossroads, I noticed a car pulling up beside me, a black '80s Mustang with tinted windows. The car's engine rumbled loudly, almost menacingly, as it idled next to mine. I didn't think much of it. Cars like that had a way of demanding attention, and I figured the driver was just another enthusiast showing off. When the light turned green, the Mustang roared to life, screeching off the line and disappearing into the distance with an impressive burst of speed. I chuckled to myself, shaking my head at the unnecessary display. Just another guy looking to show off, I thought as I continued my peaceful drive. But the Mustang wasn't done with me. A few miles down the highway, my rearview mirror lit up with blinding high beams. At first, I thought it was a careless driver, but as the lights closed in, I realized it was the same Mustang. It was tailing me closely, its erratic movements making my pulse quicken. The car swerved sharply, darting into the lane beside me before cutting back in front and slamming on the brakes. I had no choice but to veer into the other lane to avoid a collision, my hands gripping the steering wheel as my heart pounded. The Mustang then pulled up alongside me, its tires hugging the center line. For a terrifying moment, it swerved toward my car, threatening to sideswipe me. I tried to keep calm, but the chaos of the situation made it impossible. My phone had slid off the passenger seat during one of the sharp turns, and I couldn't reach it. The driver in the Mustang didn't relent, continuing to swerve and brake erratically, forcing me to maneuver desperately just to avoid an accident. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Mustang sped off, its taillights disappearing into the distance. I slowed down, my hands trembling as I replayed the events in my mind. I couldn't let this go. I focused on the license plate, committing the numbers to memory. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I had to report it. By the time I reached the nearest police station, my nerves were shot. My hands were still shaking as I parked and walked inside, replaying the erratic pursuit over and over in my mind. The Mustang's driver hadn't just been reckless, they had been malicious, deliberate in their attempts to intimidate and endanger me. The officer on duty greeted me with a professional but tired expression. I explained what had happened, describing the Mustang's aggressive behavior and the close calls it had forced on the highway. When I mentioned the license plate, the officer's demeanor shifted slightly, his brow furrowing as he jotted down the details. After entering the plate into their system, he paused and glanced at me. "The plate belongs to someone who's deceased," he said. "It was likely stolen." A chill ran through me. The knowledge that the car's plate wasn't legitimate made the situation even more unsettling. Whoever was driving that Mustang hadn't just been reckless. They were hiding something. The officer filed the report, advising me to stay vigilant and avoid any further encounters with the car. "You're lucky it didn't escalate further," he said. Though the officer's words were meant to reassure me, they only added to my unease. As I drove home, the darkness outside the windows felt heavier, the once familiar roads now tinged with foreboding. I pulled into my driveway later that night, relieved to finally be home. The house felt like a sanctuary after the tension of the highway and the grim revelation at the police station. Exhausted, I went through my nightly routine and tried to convince myself that the ordeal was over. Around midnight, just as I was starting to drift off, a loud banging shattered the quiet. It was coming from my garage door, heavy, deliberate thuds that reverberated through the house. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, straining to listen. Another series of bangs followed, and my pulse quickened with fear. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained what was happening. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes stretched endlessly as I waited. I peeked out of a window facing the garage, but whoever was out there was gone by the time I looked. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no signs of anyone. The garage door showed no damage, and there were no tracks or other clues to suggest who had been there. Still, the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. Had the Mustang's driver followed me home? Were they trying to intimidate me further? Days passed, and thank heavens I never saw him again.